Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier with another presentation for your revision program, this time on America's policy of containment. Like the Cold War itself, be ready with a single sentence definition and a slightly longer one, should you need them in your exam. Remember, question A can always ask for a definition. The policy of containment was not itself a policy for war. It was a policy to contain communism, prevent the spread of an ideology that stood in stark contrast to capitalism and liberalism. However, in containing communism, it was also a policy to bring about its collapse. And this should not be forgotten. Think of Kennan's long telegram. It set out to starve communism of trading partners, whilst at the same time forcing it to spend money it couldn't afford on its military, and so starve its people of the material benefits enjoyed in the West. All this was done in order to bring about the collapse of the communist regimes from within. In other words, by the hands of their own peoples. The syllabus directs you to consider 3 different crisis points in America's policy of containment. Do try to keep them in the wider context of the Cold War, though each is, in fact, quite different in the way the crises came to be, how they unfolded, and in their consequences. So though they are each part of the Cold War and America's policy of containment, and that might be used, briefly, in any of your responses, don't lose sight of their uniqueness. Why, what, and consequences are going to be your best approach in covering the 3 crises. Why did each crisis happen? Think of the context as well as specific reasons, and you will see what I mean by this when I take a look at each of the crises. What happened? And the key thing for you to think about here is how do you move beyond the descriptive? Make links to the question. It will be specific in nature. And make the significance of your overall point and each sub-point clear. The consequences of each crisis. Think about the specific crisis, of course, but also think about the wider Cold War context. Now, if you're doing these things, you have to be scoring well. So let's take a look at Korea. Of course, the way World War II had ended, with Korea divided at the 38th parallel and the UN charged with overseeing elections, is very important. And that North Korea was led by the communist Kim Il-sung, and South Korea was led by the anti-communist Syngman Rhee, makes it a Cold War issue. But from there, your revision has to add some detail. But it is Kim Il-sung, determined to unite the peninsula, who forces the issue. He goes to Moscow in order to get permission to invade the South. But it is not a Soviet initiative, and certainly wasn't a Chinese initiative. Make that clear. But for America, they can't see it any other way, particularly after the way in which China had been lost, as the Americans saw it, to the communists. Though you should also comment on the almost neurotic anti-communism that had a stranglehold on American politics at the time. As for what happened, You should make sure to include in your revision the initial successes of the North Koreans, which also helps to demonstrate that they had planned the invasion, how the UN got to be involved, and include the Soviet Union's boycott in that, the nature of the UN force, how international was it, and the success in pushing the North Koreans back, only to be pushed back themselves when Chinese volunteers also got involved, so that it all ended up where it began, with a divided Korea on the 38th parallel. Give some thought to General MacArthur's contribution too. As for the consequences, first and foremost, it was tragic for Koreans. And whether you're a stats person or prefer the human story, do have something to say on this. History is always about people. And there were military casualties on both sides. But there was also the Cold War issues. That whilst America had showed its allies it would stand firm, it did lead to an acceleration in the nuclear arms race, as well as a harder anti-West line taken by the Chinese. And there was also the fact that the UN had been compromised as far as the communist world was concerned. And finally, and to bring us right up to date, look at what it did to both Koreas. So to Cuba. Whereas Korea was only partially a Cold War issue, the Cuban Missile Crisis was an outright Cold War issue. The Castro Revolution in Cuba and the Bay of Pigs fiasco, of course, were all part of the context to the missile crisis. But so too was the Berlin Wall. And of course, it should also be seen very much as part of the nuclear arms race. I spend about 6 pages on the arms race in my ebook on Containment. You won't get a direct question on the arms race, but it's hugely important context, and it's both interesting and very important to the world we live in. So I think it's worth 15 or 20 minutes of our time reading about it. But of course, the immediate cause of the crisis was the decision by the Soviet Union to put missiles on Cuban soil, and to the fact that America had a new president in place. As to what happened over 13 nerve-wracking days, and do spare some time to think about how dangerous those 13 days were, it was a high-stakes game of hard-nosed diplomacy, mixed with some bluff and counter-bluff, in which some frighteningly dangerous points were reached before diplomacy won the day, and we can all be grateful for that. You should be aware of the Soviet Union's reasons for placing the missiles in Cuba, for the options Kennedy had to choose between, and in turn those that Khrushchev faced, as well as why the two leaders decided to step back from the brink. As for the consequences, well, both sides fully appreciated the dangers of nuclear war, and you should be aware of how the two superpowers responded. You should also be aware of the details to the agreement, and too how it affected the standing of the two leaders amongst their own people. But if you're asked about who won, my advice would not to immediately side with Kennedy and the Americans. Yes, Khrushchev paid the price for compromising, whilst Kennedy was seen as strong, but he was assassinated, and the Soviet Union actually got a lot out of the deal. And if there was a real winner, it was the world. including you and me. And so, finally, Vietnam, the third of the crises. The context is largely the Cold War. Vietnam was where America, for a second time, drew a line on communist expansion in Asia. But like Korea, where it first drew the line, Vietnam was also a result of World War II, and again, like Korea, was divided between a communist North and a non-communist South when the war ended, though this time it was at the 17th parallel. And it was also a consequence of French imperialism, Vietnam being part of pre-war French Indochina, Laos and Cambodia making up the other two parts, which France lost during World War II and failed in its attempt to win it back after the war. As for a specific reason, it was America's domino theory that dragged it into Vietnam when the French attempt to hold on to Vietnam failed. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was an excuse more than a reason. You can include it, but make the point. It will show that you are thinking about your history, and show how, in fact, America got ever more deeply involved in Vietnam, step by step, each step making it harder for them to back away. As to what happened in Vietnam, it was a war fought between a peasantry, backed by the Soviet Union and the PRC, and a superpower. So it was a war in which you contrast the Viet Cong's guerrilla tactics against America's military might, and its reliance on heavy bombing, including napalm and the use of Agent Orange, and on the ground, the search and destroy tactic, so that America lost the support of the majority of the Vietnamese people. The Viet Cong strategy was to make America give up. America's strategy was to win the war. And you need to build up an argument as to why the Viet Cong's tactics were successful, and why America's strategy and its tactics failed. And this will include the way in which America lost the support of its own people. Like Korea, the consequences were tragic for Vietnam. And again, whether you're a stats person or prefer the human story, be ready to get your point down on paper. And for America, the consequences, I think, were all bad. It was a huge blow to American morale. Whatever it may have said, it had lost the war. It had not achieved any of its aims. America had lost some support from its allies, and a lot of support from amongst its own people. America had lost the moral high ground. It could no longer be seen as always being in the right. Perhaps the only positive for America was that the war hadn't dragged the Soviet Union or the PRC directly into the fight. As for the Soviet Union and the PRC, for them it was a public relations present, just as for America it was a PR disaster. It was always highly unlikely that the Vietnam War would escalate, though America risked doing so when it secretly and illegally bombed Cambodia. And so from their viewpoint, that's the Soviet Union and the PRC, the longer the war went on, the better. And just one final thing to think about. You might be asked to compare two of the crises. For example, were the causes for the Korean War and the Vietnam War similar? Or was Korea more dangerous for world peace than the Cuban Missile Crisis? Or was the Cuban Missile Crisis a more successful example of containment than Vietnam? Or were the consequences to the Vietnam War more problematic to the Americans than the consequences of the Korean War? And that's it for containment. As always, I do thank you for listening. And again, I wish you every success with your revision and in your exam. Cheers.